I've been in a Pokemon mood again recently, so when I was thinking about what kind of topic I wanted to do next, I was pretty quick to decide. I say a Pokemon mood, but honestly, Pokemon has been such a huge part of my life for as long as I can remember, so I'm pretty much always in the mood for it. And I figured talking about my experiences with the franchise would be an interesting subject that people could relate to. But this led me to wonder what specifically should I talk about? I began to ask myself, even years later, why do I still like Pokemon so much? Why is Pokemon still so important to me? After really thinking about it and looking back, I found myself reminiscing about so many memories that I figured that very question, why is Pokemon still important to me? That question is what I should make this video about. I'll probably call this video Why Pokemon is Important to Me, but I guess it could also just be called My History with Pokemon, because I think that the best way for me to answer this question is to recall both my in-game experiences, but also my real-life memories as well. So with that out of the way, let's get into it. I think I can organize the Pokemon memories I have into eras. So let's start with what I call the little kid era. I've been a fan of Pokemon for about as long as I can remember. Without going into the specifics, I'm just barely a little bit younger than Pokemon. And like nearly every kid, I grew up loving Pokemon. And so, like most kids, I grew up watching the shows, I wanted the toys, I collected the plushies, the cards, I played the games, and it was pretty typical for kids to be into anything Pokemon. Going to the games, my first game was either the Leaf Green or Sapphire version. It was so long ago that I don't fully remember which one I got first because, I was really young, but I do know that I had Leaf Green and Sapphire and would, eventually I would get Emerald, but that wasn't until years later. If I had to guess, I think Leaf Green was my first game, not Sapphire. And that's because I have the original save files of both of those games. And going through them, looking at the player name and the nicknames in my Leaf Green version just scream little kid playing, ranging from gibberish nicknames, countless Pokemon called simple names like cat and rat, and sometimes random numbers added, not even in order too. I had several rat 3s, but only one rat 1 and no rat 2s. The cherry on top is that my player's name wasn't even my own name. I did not remember how to spell my name, I was that young, so I asked my brother how to spell it so he could put it in for me, but he didn't really know how to spell my name, so instead of guessing, he just wrote his name in there and told me that it was correct. And it wasn't until I looked back on my file years later that I realized I played the entire game under my brother's name, which to be fair is pretty funny to look back on. And man, the old files were rough. I was little. I only used my starter with a bunch of randomly caught Pokemon in the party that I'd never even used. My boxes were really full because I caught literally everything. I must have taken that slogan, gotta catch them all, seriously because I literally had boxes full of just Pidgeys and Rattatas and all that. Funnily enough, I actually found my first shiny due to catching everything I saw. It was a shiny Zubat. And I don't even remember seeing it as a kid. I probably didn't even know what a shiny was. I just caught everything anyways. Even after playing most of the content, I would keep playing Leaf Green and Sapphire as a kid so much, just fighting and catching everything I saw, that my Sapphire starter was level 100 and my Leaf Green was high 90s, which isn't that hard in retrospect, but as a kid who could only play in car rides and family trips, that's actually a lot of time put into that game. And actually, now that I think about it, only playing the games when I was on car rides and family trips was a core part of my Pokemon experience at the time. Pokemon became something that I took with me on trips, and would make otherwise boring car rides fun and something to look forward to. I'd say here is where we get to the next era, which I'll call the Big Fan era. That's because this is when I dove deeper into the franchise. For my birthday, I got a Pokemon Pearl version and a DS. And Pokemon Pearl is honestly one of my most memorable birthday gifts that I have received as a kid. I was the first in my family to get a DS, so everything looked especially new. Dual screens, the touch screen, stuff like the Poketopia and Pearl version blew my mind as a kid. And with the DS, I was also able to explore more of the games in the series, which started my spin-off experience. And when it comes to the spin-off games, Mystery Dungeon Blue Rescue Team is the first that comes to my mind. We also had a strategy guide, so I was able to follow a list and pick the character I wanted to play as, which was a Cubone. And I remember being so mesmerized by Mystery Dungeon. It was such a cool idea for a game setting, and I had tons of fun exploring a whole world as a Pokemon, unraveling a mystery of why I turned into a Pokemon, and it was just a good time. I also remember the first Pokemon Ranger as a kid, which was a little bit too hard for me admittedly, but much later in life I was able to come back to it and beat it and even 100% it. It's purely nostalgia, but of the Ranger games, the first one is my favorite because of all the time I put into it and because it felt so good coming back to a game that was hard as a kid and 100%ing it. As I said, this is why I called it the Big Fan Era, because while I don't exactly remember when, I also would eventually get a bunch more spin-off games like Battle Revolution, XD, Coliseum, and who can forget, Pokemon Channel. And speaking of Pokemon Channel, I know it gets memed on a lot as a do-nothing game, but I really liked Pokemon Channel as a kid. Yes, it might have been a game where you do nothing but watch TV with Pikachu, but come on, what kid wouldn't want to do nothing but laze around with Pikachu? Flipping through channels, walking in the backyard. It was a quality do-nothing game, and I still remember it fondly. On top of the games, I was still watching the anime, collecting the toys, the plushies, and the cards. And looking back, that sounds like a lot, and it kind of was, but that's why I call it the Big Fan Era. I was consuming Pokemon media, and that was probably the main thing I was doing. Speaking of Pokemon cards, they are actually how I made some of my first friends at school. Cards were banned at public schools, but kids secretly would smuggle them in and show their coolest cards in the bathrooms. It's pretty funny to remember looking back on it, but I made some genuine friends through smuggled Pokemon cards and just showing them off to each other. And it was shortly after this time that Pokemon was no longer becoming cool to the kids. So while some kids stopped being into Pokemon, those who stayed with it were pretty unified in their interests and stuck together with those friend groups, which looking back is pretty wholesome to all have one thing you guys really like and stick together for it. And then around this time, I believe Soul Silver came out, and that was really cool for me to see because I saw Johto through the anime and I played Leaf Green, so seeing Kanto was very special to me once I got to the post game. But looking back, I still only used my starter when playing these games, and at this point I don't know why. I was old enough to make a team. I know the easiest way is to play with just your starter and mashing attack buttons all day. But I watched the anime and they didn't do it in the anime, they made teams. So I don't know why it ever occurred to me to make a team like the show that I was watching so much of did. I'd learn eventually to make a team, but looking back, I'm shocked at how long I only played with my starter. Around this time, I ended up stopped watching the show because my family no longer had the TV channel it aired on. And I stopped getting stuff like the toys and the plush and the cards because I was getting older. And while I was still into those things, I was no longer little, so I had to start buying stuff with my own money. But I was a kid that did not get an allowance growing up, so I had to prioritize what little money I did get into the games. Which is probably why even now, I'm much more geared towards the games of Pokemon, and I still like all of it, but I definitely focus on the games the most. Then would come Gen 5, which is a very special gen to me in particular. I was a kid who loved to read, so I really loved the story of Black and White. The segment of the Elite Four into N's castle, into a legendary fight, into N fight, then into a Ghetsis fight was honestly amazing. It was such a memorable finale in Pokemon even to this day. But after playing through the game and the post game, I just wanted to keep playing Pokemon, which led me to have the idea to actually complete the Pokédex, which I know is the catchphrase, but personally I didn't know anybody who did that, but I was pretty determined to give it a go. I remember looking up a list of Pokemon I was missing and manually writing them down on a notepad with empty checkboxes for me to fill. And then I would start to trade with my friends at school and family members for exclusive Pokemon that I was missing. I would hatch eggs, grind the Elite Four, fight Charen, Bianca, Cynthia, even the sports stadiums, everything I could to evolve all the Pokemon, and for a while, doing this made Black and White like the main game I played, and I was committed to completing this dex. Eventually, I was only missing the mythical Pokemon that you can only get from like real life events, and I had no way of getting them until my cousin bought a used Pokemon White from GameStop, which had a ton of rare Pokemon on them, including the mythicals I was missing. He let me have them since he was going to reset the game anyways, so with that, I was finally able to catch every Pokemon and fill them on my decks. And unironically, it was probably one of my proudest moments when I was younger. But I mean, hey, I worked hard for that, so I think it's fair to think that completing the dex was one of my proudest moments as a kid. And I did this just in time too, because Black and White sequels were coming out soon, which led me to a cool idea that would change how I played Pokemon. This new idea would start what I call the Awakened era, partially because I began to delve more into the mechanics of the game, but also because I finally used more than just my starter for once. Because I had access to every Pokemon, I realized it would be cool to play the game with an actual team for once instead of just my starter. I finally saw the light, and I can't believe it took me completing the dex for me to think about this. Having a team throughout the game made the experience much more memorable to me, and it might be cheesy, but I actually felt like a Pokemon trainer. I experienced this cool and magical world I grew up with, using a team of Pokemon that I trained from a low level, and it was a great time. This feeling, paired with a cool sequel story of a game I already sunk so much hours into, stuff like in-game flashbacks, returning characters, and just overall quality of the game made it much more special to me, and it became my favorite Pokemon game even to this day. The biggest takeaway that I remember from X and Y is the Megas and Fairy typing. I do have a funny memory that I wasn't sold on the new designs at first. I saw the starters and I'm like, okay. I saw Fletchling and I was like, it's a Firebird, okay. I saw Honedge and I was like, Ghost Sword, okay. And then I saw it, Klefki. Now we're talking, finally an inspired concept. And then I went online and I saw so many people did not like Klefki and I could not understand it. Why are people complaining about keys being a Pokemon? I thought it was amazing, and Klefki sold me on the designs of Gen 6 moving forward. Besides that, surprisingly I don't have that much left to talk about with X and Y. I enjoyed the games, but I just don't have much standout memories, but I do plan to fix that because I actually am planning on replaying X and Y real soon, so we'll see if anything changes. It was definitely around X and Y that I remember more and more of my friends hiding that they're into Pokemon. When while I never hid that I was into Pokemon, I kind of read the vibe that it just wasn't brought up around others, and you save the conversations for when you're just with your friends. And luckily it wasn't because of bullying or anything, but others just didn't want to be seen as childish anymore, so I guess it was more of a social pressure. And I can't really blame them, people want to fit in, and I didn't want to embarrass my friends, so I just didn't bring it up for them. But man, did I begin to miss talking about Pokemon. But there'll be more on that later down memory lane. Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire came out next, and this was a big one for me at the time. It was the first remake of a game that I played a lot of, and it was very nostalgic. I decided to do something pretty special for this playthrough. I bred my starter from my original Sapphire version and used that Pokemon for this new playthrough. It was really satisfying to see the child of one of my first starters turn into a Mega Sceptile and then seeing it in the Hall of Fame is probably the most memorable thing about that game to me. And although I was pretty disappointed that there was no Battle Frontier, exploring the region by soaring on Latios or Latios was really cool and added enough for me to keep playing after beating the game. And I can't forget the Delta episode. That was an amazing add-on, referencing the original games as other universes and canonizing like multiverses to the Pokemon lore. Yeah, Pokemon lore has multiverse. Completing the post-game, I ran down the rabbit hole that is competitive Pokemon, something that would stick with me even to this day. Borrowing my friend's shiny 6IV Ditto, which in retrospect is a pretty suspicious thing, I created new teams. Not meta teams, but stuff I liked. Good but not perfect IVs, selling for like 4 sometimes. Which hey, it's not perfect, but it's a start when you're doing competitive for the first time. I had so much fun that I began to breed teams for my friends as well, and we would spend so much time staying up late doing multi-battles. Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire are the last main games in this era that I define. However, there is one more thing that I feel I need to bring up, and that is Pokemon Go. Now if you remember, everybody played Pokemon Go when it came out, but it was strange that I found myself talking about Pokemon again to people who would never previously talk about Pokemon, and it was considered normal. It was probably a mix of Go being mainstream and just people getting older and realizing who cares what other people think. Stand tall and like what you like. I'd run into people I knew from different friend groups, people who would never admit to liking Pokemon before, and we'd both be out playing Go, and we would continue playing the game together, combining friend groups. It definitely helped people be more comfortable talking about Pokemon again, and which at the time I didn't realize how much I missed that. And again, don't be afraid to like what you like. No matter the age, I can't stress that is a pretty important lesson to learn. The Pokemon Go time period is probably one of my favorite memories related to Pokemon. And that's pretty impressive because it's a purely social reason, very little to do with an actual game. But it's still really cool nonetheless, as something I definitely remember fondly. And then came the final era, which I guess I'll call the modern era. Sun and Moon were really cool games. Like yeah, the tutorials were long, but the rest were great. Having regional Pokemon was such a cool idea, and it was amazing speculating with friends on who's gonna get a new form. Ultra Beasts were really weird but in a cool way. I know some people didn't like there being island trials instead of gyms, but to me, there wasn't really a big difference. You complete a simple puzzle or mission, and then you fight a type-based boss fight to proceed in the story. It was still fun to me, and the trial fights made some pretty cool, fun, and unique boss fights. Leading into Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon, I think they would have been better received if it released later, because they added tons of new content. They added Ultra Space, new Ultra Beasts, Mantine Surfing, one of the best boss fights in Pokemon, a Victory Road which wasn't in the game before, Rainbow Rocket post-game. It was just too soon to return to what felt like 75-80% of the same game. Making it a third game or like a sequel like Sun and Moon 2 probably would have worked out way better, because it had all the right content. It was a really good game, but it just shared too much with base Sun and Moon to release not that much later. Next was Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee, which I actually did not get, one of the few main games I did not have. I just didn't feel like a main game version of Pokemon Go in Kanto appealed to me, since the gameplay wasn't the draw of Go to me, and I really didn't want to play through Kanto again. But I think one day I will revisit it, because visually it's a very pretty remake with a good art style. Which moves us on to Sword and Shield. The first thing I think of when remembering Sword and Shield was that I was definitely working by then, because it was my go-to thing to do after work, wind down and play Pokemon Sword and Shield. I even remember seriously considering calling in sick on release day because I just wanted to play that game. I still came into work, but it was on my mind all day. Graphics is a pretty valid complaint, and while I understand that, in my opinion, Sword and Shield doesn't even look bad. That is, when we're not talking about the wild area. The wild area is generally such an unappealing place to play in. Like, people who always defend Sword and Shield always talk about that one mushroom forest screenshot, but to me, what blew me away was the Galar Mines. Pokemon walking around, seeing all the jewels sparkle and glimmer, and then like a carcoal like drives on past. That was really cool. The wild area was just this generic and pretty flat area, but the routes always felt fleshed out and nice to look at, so I only went to the wild area when I had to like grind and do raids, but I never stayed there because I just didn't like the wild area. And I could see why someone looking at the wild area would only remember that looking awful. But hey, the routes still looked good in my opinion. Despite the bad rep that Sword and Shield had in the community on release, to me, it was such a great way to wind down after work and college, and so I personally have a really big attachment to that gen, and I'll always fondly remember it. In contrast, despite my nostalgia, Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl were really underwhelming to me, although the upside is that the underground was genuinely amazing. Getting cool Pokemon added way earlier added variety, and honestly, the very little that was added to Brilliant Diamond Shining Pearl was really cool. It's just unfortunate that I did not feel that I was playing a completely new experience, which is something I got from all the other remakes. So to me, it kind of just felt like a filler game to release for people to play while they waited for the next one, which isn't a good feeling. But if I had to trade an underwhelming Diamond and Pearl remake for Pokemon Legends Arceus, then I'll take that trade. Because honestly, it was such a fresh new entry to the series. Unsurprisingly, I really loved Pokemon Legends Arceus. The new ways of catching and exploring Pokemon was really fun. However, my hot take is that I don't want these mechanics to replace the main game's catching. Some people really want that, and I can see why since it's really fun, but I would like to keep that in for just Legends games if they keep making more. Because in my opinion, there would just be no real reason to battle wild Pokemon anymore. I even began to avoid most battles in Pokemon Legends Arceus and just kept throwing Pokeballs instead. And I feel like a player should never not want to battle in a Pokemon game when the whole premise of the game is catching and battling. But anyways, Hisui was such a cool new take on Sinnoh. It was this new but familiar feeling, which is the feeling I hoped Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl was going to give me. The only downside to Legends Arceus that I could think of was that I really did not enjoy battling in that game. Which is fine since again, it wasn't the focus, catching was. It just felt really awkward, especially when fighting multiple Pokemon at once because big AoE moves didn't exist, so fighting in groups was especially annoying. The new Hisui mons were all really cool, my favorite being Ursaluna. As a long-time Teddiursa fan, I was so happy that Teddiursa finally got something, and it was about time. The new legendary forms was really weird but interesting idea, where like these gods traded their gifts for raw power. It was definitely an interesting take. I could still go back and play through Legends Arceus anytime, and I would really love more Legends games. Personally, I would really love a Legends Kyurem game. You know, there's so many ancient castles in Black and White, you could have them be like fully lived in castles, complete dragon form, there's so much to think about. So please Game Freak, make more of these games, especially in Gen 5. Finally, we're at the newest entry at the moment of this video, Scarlet and Violet. The first thing that I gotta say is that I really loved the lore of these games. It was pretty interesting having this mysterious crater in the center of the map that your Miraidon or Koraidon come from, that no one is allowed to go into. When Arven showed up in his story showing his dying Pokemon, I was immediately hooked and prioritized his story especially. Nemona and Penny were cool, but Arven is probably my favorite of the three, and I can't forget Professor Clavel, or should I say Clive, in Penny's story. He's probably my second favorite character in Scarlet and Violet. The fully open world game was pretty interesting, and worked better than I expected. My playthrough being different from others playing the same game was a really cool feeling for Pokemon. And Area Zero and the Paradox Pokemon were in my opinion the peak of Scarlet and Violet's story. I really love it when Game Freak leans into the weird Pokemon lore like Ultra Beasts and multiverses, and Paradox Pokemon felt like more of that. Scarlet and Violet could honestly be a contender for one of my favorite Pokemon games, but I can't completely ignore the technical issues. The game crashed at least once or twice on day one, but I think there was like a quick patch because after that I never really crashed. But I have had multiple times where the game felt like it was going to crash and I was afraid that I was going to lose all my progress again. Personally, the issues are not enough for me to dislike it, but I fully understand when others do. In my opinion, it's solid despite its flaws, but I obviously wish that those flaws didn't exist at all. Looking back, Pokemon has remained a source of childlike joy, and in the least depressing way I can put it, that kind of joy is rare and hard to come by. So if something gives you that feeling, I say hold on tight to it. It's because of Pokemon that I made some of my earliest friends, and I also learned not to be ashamed and stick with what I'm into. I'm just glad that as I get older, I still get that same rush of joy in Pokemon, and I definitely intend to hold tight to that feeling. So yeah, I guess that is why I really value Pokemon, and why it stayed really important to me. Yo, thanks again for sticking around. I have a feeling that this video might have been a long one due to how far back I had to go and how much I had to talk about. And I didn't even go into stuff like a lot of the spin-off details and even the DLC. As you can probably tell, this one was a little bit more personal, going to aspects of my actual life sometimes. So I'm glad that I was able to get this one out there. It was pretty interesting to write about my own experiences, and I gotta admit, I learned a little bit about myself during this as well. This one was pretty fun to do, so keep expecting more to come.